Welcome to EchoShade, where history whispers its darkest secrets and forgotten stories.
In the beginning, there were no rules attached to a body. No one stood above another because of a word like a man or a woman. People simply existed in rhythms of survival, their roles shifting like seasons. A person strong enough to hunt joined the hunt. A person skilled at gathering moved through the forests collecting roots and berries. A person with steady hands tended the fire and healed the sick. No one questioned who should do what. Life demanded cooperation, not definitions. The earliest human groups left behind traces that confuse modern expectations. Graves where individuals buried with weapons turn out biologically female, and graves filled with beads or ornaments belong to biological males. The people who lived in these ancient ages did not operate on binaries. Their world was fluid. Their responsibilities depended on ability, not assigned identity. Yet something subtle began to change when humans discovered the power of seed and soil. Farming replaced wandering. Villages took root. Land became valuable. Property demanded protection. Resources demanded ownership. And through these gradual changes, a new idea took shape. An idea that certain bodies should inherit, rule, defend, and lead, while others should nurture, maintain, serve, and obey. The shift did not happen overnight. It grew quietly like the crops themselves. Those who left home to trade or fight, mostly men, became decision-makers by proximity. Those who remained near the hearth, mostly women, became associated with home and children. Over time, these patterns hardened into expectations, and expectations became unwritten laws. Soon, stories reflected these divisions. Myths began portraying strength as masculine and nurture as feminine. Divine beings in earlier eras had shifted gender freely, but now gods were painted with rigid identities that mirrored human hierarchy. The old fluidity faded. Civilizations began to inscribe power into stone. In Mesopotamia, early legal codes placed responsibility, inheritance, and authority in the hands of men. Roles that once emerged naturally were now enforced by written laws. Women became bound to domestic spaces, their value measured through marriage, purity, and childbearing. Men became guardians, rulers, and property holders. In ancient societies, philosophy rose alongside politics. Thinkers defined not only the universe, but the human body itself. Some declared men rational and suited to public life, while women were described as emotional, incomplete, or lesser forms of men. The world absorbed these ideas as absolute truths, forgetting that they were merely opinions crafted by people in power. The structure strengthened with empire building. Governance, warfare, and wealth demanded a clear lineage. Those in authority needed certainty about heirs, inheritance, and legitimacy. And so gender roles became tools, a way to control marriage, reproduction, and social order. Religious institutions solidified these patterns further. Interpretations written by men shaped doctrines for centuries. Bodies that once carried no assigned destiny were now locked inside roles believed to be divinely ordained. The world began to see gender not as a social arrangement, but as fate. Across continents, cultures adapted the idea in their own ways, sometimes oppressive, sometimes flexible, but almost always structured around preserving power. In many places, women were denied education, denied property rights, denied leadership, and denied autonomy. In some societies, men were restricted too, expected to be dominant providers even when circumstances differed. The machinery of gender became self-generating. Children grew into roles predetermined by their birth. A boy might be groomed for leadership even if his temperament resisted it. A girl might be trained for domesticity even if her talents pointed elsewhere. Identity became a script, one written long before the child could speak. As empires rose, administration relied on these divisions. Governments created laws that tied behavior, clothing, and duties to gender. Entire political systems rested on these divisions, convincing people that they were natural, inevitable, unquestionable. Even in societies that allowed exceptions, female warriors, male healers, gender-fluid spiritual figures, these exceptions were framed as anomalies rather than norms. The world became accustomed to binary categories, forgetting that earlier humans had never lived this way. Who really decided gender? No single individual, no single empire, no specific religion. It was a cumulative creation shaped by economics, power, inheritance, stability, and control. The blame lies not in one moment of history, but in a long chain of choices, systems, and interpretations that reinforced one another until they formed a global structure. Yet beneath this structure, the truth remained intact. Gender was never a law of nature. It was a human invention, crafted, enforced, defended, and transmitted through generations. As time moved toward the modern age, the consequences of those ancient decisions continued to shape lives. People were judged, punished, elevated, or diminished not because of who they were, but because of what society decided they should be. The rules hardened into traditions, and traditions disguised themselves as morality. Entire identities were policed, entire possibilities restricted. But even within this rigid framework, people kept challenging the boundaries. History is filled with individuals who stepped outside expected roles, rulers, warriors, scholars, healers, rebels, whose lives proved that gender was never destiny. These stories, often silenced or overlooked, remained as evidence that human identity cannot be contained by ancient decisions. Part 1 ends as societies stand on the brink of empires, religions, and philosophies that will further reshape gender into a tool of authority, regulation, and blame. Across the early ancient world, societies continued expanding, and each expansion added another layer of structure to gender. What began as flexible became rigid, and what began as survival-based became ceremonial, moral, and political. By the time cities rose with high walls and crowded markets, gender had become an invisible architecture shaping daily life. In Egypt, gender appeared more balanced on the surface. Women could own property, initiate divorce, and even rule as pharaohs. Yet these exceptions hid a deeper truth. Power was still structured primarily through male lineage, and even female rulers often portrayed themselves in masculine imagery to be accepted by the court. Their identities had to align with the expectations of the throne. A woman could lead, but she had to lead like a man. The role was defined, and the person had to fit the role, not the other way around. In China, Confucian ideals emerged, emphasizing order, hierarchy, and family roles. A man was expected to lead the household and maintain lineage. A woman was expected to obey her father, then her husband, then her son. Her voice was not part of public decision-making, not because she lacked intellect, but because social order depended on restricting her sphere. Gender became a moral duty. Deviating from it meant disturbing harmony. Even when women rose to power like Empress Wu, they were scrutinized more than any man, their every action evaluated under the shadow of this rigid structure. In India, ancient texts laid out roles in layered systems. Families passed on expectations like heirlooms. Some women gained influence as scholars or queens, yet the majority moved within boundaries defined by scriptural interpretation. Their bodies symbolized family honor. Their roles symbolized tradition. Their futures often bound to marriage alliances that maintained social hierarchy. Again, not nature, just system. In Greece, the birthplace of celebrated philosophy, gender inequality reached sophisticated levels. Women were excluded from political life entirely, raised indoors, trained for obedience. One might imagine that a civilization obsessed with logic would question its own biases, but here, logic itself was manipulated to justify hierarchy. Books were written, arguments crafted, social order rationalized through intellectual disguise. Food. A woman was framed as incomplete, unable to reason fully, destined to remain inside while men shaped the world outside. And because these ideas came from respected thinkers, future generations accepted them without question. Rome absorbed these ideas and expanded them with law. Code after code defined the duties of women and the authority of men. Marriage became a contract of control. The family became a miniature state, with the father holding near absolute power. A woman's capacity to manage business or property was restricted not by biology, but by legal design. The empire's vast bureaucracy needed clear lines of inheritance, and gender roles stabilized those lines. Society claimed these roles were natural, but in reality, they were administrative. As trade expanded across continents, gender rules traveled with it. Caravans carried spices, textiles, metals, and the invisible weight of social expectations. A woman in one region could be a warrior, while in another, she could not even speak in public without being shamed. A man in one culture could be tender and artistic, while in another he was expected to remain stoic and brutal. The decisions were never universal, they were culturally engineered. The rise of major world religions amplified these divisions. Interpretations carried more authority than evidence. Laws written by men were said to reflect divine will. Women found their bodies regulated in the name of modesty, morality, or purity. Men found their emotions regulated in the name of strength, dignity, or honor. Both were trapped in scripts written long before they were born. The medieval era brought its own reinforcements. Feudal systems needed order, and order relied on predictable roles. Men handled war and property. Women handled home and lineage. And the idea became so entrenched that even small deviations appeared threatening. A woman who spoke too boldly could be labeled unruly or dangerous. A man who showed softness could be ridiculed. The prison was invisible, yet every mind lived inside it. Education was restricted deliberately. Knowledge was linked to authority, and authority to gender. Women were denied it so they could not challenge systems built without their input. Men were shaped by it so they would willingly uphold the structures that benefited them. The system became self-sustaining. Women lacked power because they lacked education, and they lacked education because the powerful denied it to them. Yet the cracks in the system always existed. Across every century, individuals challenged their assigned roles. Monks. Some women disguised themselves as men to join armies or travel freely. Some men rejected warrior expectations, choosing poetry, art, or scholarship instead. Some cultures allowed fluid identities through religious or spiritual roles. But these stories were often hidden, rewritten, or erased so the dominant narrative of binary gender could remain unchallenged. Colonialism later spread European gender norms across continents. Indigenous communities with gender-fluid systems found themselves forced into rigid categories. People who once held respected spiritual roles were labeled unnatural or immoral. Colonizers replaced diverse identities with their own binaries, converting entire societies in the name of civilization. But behind the word of civilization was simply control. As empires expanded, gender became a political tool. Defining women as weak justified denying them power. Defining men as strong justified sending them to war. Defining both as opposites justified controlling their relationships, desires, and futures. Every definition served someone's purpose. This was the hidden machinery behind gender. The system no one voted for, yet everyone inherited. The Renaissance, often seen as a rebirth of human potential, revived knowledge but not equality. Art celebrated the human form, yet society continued to constrain actual humans. Women inspired paintings but rarely created them. Men wrote about beauty while rejecting the intellect of the people portrayed. Gender remained a cage, gold-plated but still confining. Slowly, whispers of resistance grew. Women began writing, arguing, demanding recognition. Men began questioning emotional restrictions placed on them. Philosophers debated equality, although many still clung to superiority disguised as reason. Revolutions promised freedom, but rarely expanded it to include gender equality. New governments formed, but old ideas lingered. Even as industrialization reshaped economies, gender roles were weaponized to stabilize society. Men were workers, women caretakers. Men were public, women private. Men earned wages, women earned invisibility. Both trapped in roles assigned centuries before. Closes as humanity approaches the modern age, carrying ancient decisions like invisible luggage. Unaware of how many choices made thousands of years ago still shape their daily lives. As the world stepped into the early modern era, the weight of ancient gender decisions still pressed on every household, every village, every kingdom. People lived inside rules older than their grandfathers, older than their languages, older than their nation. The boundaries between a man and a woman had become so habitual that few questioned their origins. Generations accepted them as natural, unaware that centuries of historical engineering had shaped these roles long before they were born. In many regions, gender roles became tied to honor. A woman's behavior reflected not only on herself, but on her entire family. A man's reputation depended on his ability to provide and dominate. Both were trapped by standards created to maintain social control. A woman who stepped outside expectations risked shame or punishment, even if her actions posed no real harm. A man who showed vulnerability was mocked, even if his softness carried no weakness. The system was less about biology and more about obedience. Meanwhile, global trade connected continents, but it also carried cultural restrictions along with goods. European merchants and missionaries introduced their rigid ideas of gender into societies that once had more fluid systems. In many African, Indigenous American, and Polynesian cultures, individuals with mixed or third gender roles held respected spiritual or social positions. But colonizers dismissed these roles as primitive or immoral, replacing them with stricter binaries. These communities lost more than land. They lost the freedom to define their identities in their own ways. The printing press spread knowledge across borders, yet most printed works repeated the same ideas about gender. Books written by men for men shaped public thought. Theories about female weakness or male superiority became more widespread, wrapped in scholarly language that made them seem scientific. Women who attempted to publish under their own names faced rejection, ridicule, or censorship. Some wrote under male pseudonyms because their society would not take them seriously otherwise. Still, resistance persisted in quiet corners. Some women kept personal journals questioning unfair customs. Some men wrote poetry, expressing emotions society told them to conceal. Some individuals defied dress codes or roles, refusing to fit into the boxes assigned to them. But these stories rarely reached the mainstream. Those in power chose which voices to amplify and which to silence. Then came the Enlightenment, an era that claimed to value reason, liberty, and equality. But even here, gender equality was missing. Many thinkers who advocated freedom for the oppressed still believed women should remain subordinate. They demanded independence from kings, but refused to acknowledge women's independence. They fought against tyranny, but maintained it at home. The contradiction was obvious, yet few addressed it. Revolutions erupted with promises of new beginnings, America fought for liberty from British rule, France fought for equality among its citizens, Latin America fought for independence from colonial powers. But none of these revolutions extended their promises fully to women or gender minorities. The idea of equality remained selective. The world celebrated freedom, but within the home, old hierarchies continued unchanged. Industrialization put pressure on these roles. As factories multiplied, society needed more workers. Men, women, and even children entered harsh, demanding labor. Yet despite similar work, women received lower wages. Their contributions were essential, but society minimized their value. Gender became an economic tool, justifying unequal pay, unequal opportunities, and unequal recognition. At the same time, urbanization brought new interactions and new ideas. People from different backgrounds met in cramped neighborhoods and crowded streets. Conversations moved from private courtyards to public spaces. Women joined movements demanding education, property rights, and legal recognition. Men began to question the emotional restrictions placed on them. The old world struggled to contain the growing desire for change. The sciences entered the debate, some offering justification for inequality, others challenging it. Early biology tried to define gender through anatomy alone, ignoring the social systems that shaped behavior. But psychology and anthropology slowly revealed what ancient societies had known long before. Culture influences identity. Gender was not simply a biological fact. It was a social construction with deep historical roots. Despite these breakthroughs, resistance remained strong. Traditionalists feared losing control if gender roles changed. Governments worried about disrupting social order. Religious institutions refused to reconsider centuries-old interpretations. The debate grew louder as more people questioned the foundations of gender expectations. Across continents, new movements formed. Women demanded the right to vote, the right to study, the right to work without male permission. Their struggles faced opposition, ridicule, and sometimes violence. But slowly, barriers began to fall. Laws changed, access broadened, opportunities expanded. Yet the deeper structure that shaped society's expectations remained embedded in cultural norms. Even as women gained visibility, gender expectations tightened around men. They were raised to suppress tears, hide fear, and conceal vulnerability. They were expected to be protectors, providers, leaders, whether they wanted to be or not. Society punished deviation harshly. A man who refused to fight was labeled cowardly. A man who rejected dominance was seen as fragile. The binary box trapped everyone, not just women. The world entered the 20th century carrying centuries of gender conditioning. Wars erupted, reshaping families, economies, and national identities. During wartime, women filled roles previously considered masculine, working in factories, driving trucks, serving as nurses near the front lines, managing households alone. When the wars ended, many were forced back into restricted roles, despite having proven their capabilities beyond a doubt. Societies wanted to restore old norms, fearing that change threatened stability. But change had already begun. The contradictions became impossible to ignore. The idea that certain tasks belonged exclusively to one gender started to crumble. The idea that leadership required a male body lost credibility. The idea that identity should be dictated by tradition became less convincing. Technology connected the world even further. Voices once silenced gained platforms. People who had lived hidden within rigid systems began sharing their experiences. The diversity of human identity, once documented in ancient cultures but erased by centuries of control, started resurfacing. It at a moment of global tension, where old systems still hold power but modern voices rise against them. The question becomes louder, sharper, more urgent. If gender was engineered through history, who gains from maintaining it, and who suffers from obeying it? Yet, as the world stepped deeper into the modern era, the systems that shaped gender for thousands of years found themselves confronted by new realities. For centuries, these systems operated quietly, hidden beneath culture, religion, economy, and tradition. But technology made their shadows visible. People could now compare their lives across continents, question inherited beliefs, and expose injustices that once hid behind. Every generation carried pieces of the old world within them, often without knowing where those ideas originated. A mother repeated the rules taught to her. A father enforced expectations he had never questioned. Communities judged behavior through lenses shaped not by truth, but by centuries of conditioning. And still, people obeyed roles that no longer fit the world around them. In schools, children continued to absorb restricted visions of identity. Boys were encouraged to lead, compete, and suppress emotion. Girls were taught to be nurturing, polite, and careful. Even when teachers meant well, society's framework guided their expectations. A boy who excelled in art was redirected toward more practical paths. A girl who showed interest in science was told it would be difficult. The voices shaping these children rarely recognized the origin of their own biases. Yet the resistance grew stronger with every decade. Writers challenged binaries once considered sacred. Activists marched against norms shaped by ancestors they never met. Quiet thinkers questioned the meaning of identity itself. The world was changing faster than the structures that governed it. As global conflicts reshaped borders and economies, new opportunities emerged. Women entered universities, laboratories, and governments. Their presence challenged assumptions embedded for centuries. Bays. Men explored professions or passions once labeled feminine, discovering unrestricted parts of themselves. These shifts did not destroy society, they strengthened it. But the idea that gender roles were necessary persisted in many minds, fueled by nostalgia for an imagined past that never truly existed. The 20th century delivered revolutions not fought with armies, but with ideas. Each movement against injustice, civil rights, labor rights, human rights, implicitly questioned gender roles as well. As people demanded equality in one domain, they realized inequality in another. Identity became a battlefield, not because people wanted conflict, but because oppression had been normalized for too long. Amid this transformation, old power structures resisted hard. Governments enacted policies based on outdated views. Communities clung to hierarchies that gave them certainty, even if those hierarchies harmed individuals. Religious leaders interpreted ancient texts through patriarchal lenses, ignoring more flexible or contextual understandings. The world stood in tension, pulled between tradition and reality. Yet, despite resistance, the truth became harder to ignore. Gender was never a fixed law, but a historical construction influenced by power, control, and utility. In workplaces, women proved their competence repeatedly, yet faced barriers disguised as concern or practicality. Men faced pressure to embody strength even when it damaged their mental health. Expectations forced individuals into conflict with themselves. The binary structure that once seemed natural now appeared restrictive and outdated. Science advanced, revealing complexities in biology that contradicted simplistic notions. Anthropology uncovered forgotten cultures where gender had been fluid, diverse, and respected. Psychology demonstrated that identity could not be confined to two categories. Every new piece of knowledge chipped away at the belief that gender roles were destiny. Meanwhile, millions around the world continued to live inside expectations they did not choose. Some felt trapped by labels that didn't reflect their reality. Some felt pressured to fit roles defined before they were born. Others were punished for crossing invisible boundaries. the struggle was not simply about rights. It was about truth. The rise of digital communication amplified these conversations. Stories that once remained private now reached global audiences. People discovered others who felt the same confusion, restriction, or frustration. Communities formed, not based on roles imposed by history, but on shared humanity. The world realized that people had always been diverse. It was society that insisted on uniformity. With this awakening came discomfort. Systems designed around rigid gender roles lost their certainty. Institutions built on binary assumptions faced questions they were not prepared to answer. Those who benefited from the old hierarchy feared losing privilege. Those oppressed by it demanded justice. In governments, debates over identity intensified. Some argued that tradition must be preserved for stability. Others insisted that freedom required acknowledging the full spectrum of human experience. Nations passed laws granting new rights while others enacted restrictions, revealing how deeply the roots of historical gender decisions still penetrated. Despite progress, misconceptions persisted. Many still believed gender roles emerged naturally rather than historically. They defended ancient decisions as biological truths, unaware that those decisions had been shaped by economic necessity, property systems, or political interests. The historical blame remained concealed beneath generations of repetitive teaching. But a new understanding grew. Questioning gender roles was not an attack on culture. It was a reclamation of human potential. The world began recognizing that identity was richer, deeper, and more personal than any binary structure could contain. Individuals started reclaiming autonomy over their own roles. Women pursued leadership without apology. Men embraced vulnerability without shame. People who did not fit traditional categories found language, community, and recognition that previous generations were denied. The transformation was ongoing, incomplete, but unmistakable. What centuries of power had tried to suppress was now rising to the surface. Gender had always been a flexible spectrum, reshaped repeatedly by culture, politics, and survival. What seemed eternal was actually constructed. Humanity started asking a more honest question, not who people should be, but who they truly are. The story of gender was no longer controlled by ancient lawmakers, philosophers, or rulers. It was being rewritten by individuals who finally understood the history behind the constraints. In this new era, the responsibilities shifted. No longer could societies hide behind tradition or claim nature as justification. The world had learned too much. The evidence was clear. We see the future now rests on the awareness that gender was shaped by human hands. Created, enforced, and justified through centuries of power. And if humans invented it, humans can redefine it. The weight of historical blame becomes a tool for modern clarity, revealing not only who created these roles, but also who has the power to uncreate them. The script ends with the understanding that identity belongs to the individual, not to ancient decisions, and that the evolution of gender is a story still unfolding, one that now demands honesty instead of obedience, truth instead of tradition, and freedom instead of fear. The dawn of a new age approached as civilizations became taller, richer, more complex. But beneath every monument of marble and gold, an unseen design pulsed quietly, the architecture of gender power. This part of history is rarely told because it was never officially written. It was etched in customs, whispered in rituals, and protected by those who gained the most from it. Gender was no longer a simple division of tasks. It had become a mechanism, a system, a deliberate structure, a tool to preserve control. Across ancient archives and forgotten ruins, a pattern emerges, one that reveals how a select few shaped the world's understanding of masculinity, femininity, bodies, roles, privileges, and limitations. The story begins with a handful of rulers, priests, lawmakers, and scholars who understood something profound. Control the definition of gender, and you control the foundation of society itself. They didn't announce it, they didn't debate it. They simply built the world around it. The first manuals of gender. Laws that outlived their creators in Mesopotamia. As scribes carved tablets in careful strokes, something more impactful than warfare was being created. Legal gender. These were not descriptions of nature. They were rules of behavior. A husband could own property. A wife could not. A man could divorce easily. A woman could only leave under specific conditions. A man's testimony weighed more. A woman's testimony required witnesses to be validated. These tablets did not reflect the world. They reshaped it. Before them, roles changed with circumstances. After them, roles became fixed. And when a rule is carved into clay, it becomes harder than stone. Even kings feared rewriting it. Even empires adopted it. Even religions absorbed. Mesopotamia's scribes had unknowingly created the first gender blueprint. A template that crossed borders long after their kingdom fell. The elite benefit. A small group that profited from definitions' power in ancient societies often rested in the hands of three groups. 1. High-ranking men. 2. Religious authorities. 3. Wealthy landowners. They were not a majority. They were simply the loudest. For them, rigid gender roles were convenient. If women stayed within domestic boundaries, elite men controlled. Inheritance land, political decisions, marriage alliances, economic negotiation, religious authority, every system they built served their interests. Their interpretation of gender wasn't a cultural truth. It was a strategy, a very effective one. And over centuries, that strategy transformed into tradition. People forgot who wrote the rules. They remembered only that the rules always existed, but they hadn't. They were designed by those who needed society to bend toward their convenience. The era of text, when scripture and scholarship became weapons as literacy spread, gender definitions grew even stronger because they were no longer spoken, they were documented. In Greece, philosophers debated nature versus nurture while quietly assuming gender hierarchy as a starting point. Their students memorized these ideas, repeated them, and taught them again. In Rome, household laws became tight chains that organized family life around patriarchy. Marriage became a contract of ownership. Reproduction became a state duty, and gender behavior became a moral obligation. Then religions across the world, old and new, absorbed these pre-existing gender laws into their own texts. Not always intentionally, but influence travels silently. A single line within a scripture could shift gender expectations for centuries. A single scholar's interpretation could alter millions of lives. A single translation could change how gender was understood by entire civilizations. And so, the architecture became permanent. Even when women ruled kingdoms, even when women commanded armies, even when women led revolutions, the blueprint of gender remained embedded in the structure of society, resurfacing in laws, traditions, and moral values. Gender as national identity, a new form of control by the medieval period. Rulers realized that gender was not just a family system, it was a political instrument. A kingdom's stability relied on predictable gender roles. Who inherits the throne, who oversees domestic labor, conjugal labor, who represents the household publicly, who produces heirs, who is loyal, silent, obedient, or visible powerful monarchs used gender as a currency to maintain order. Priests used it to establish moral hierarchies. Economies used it to justify unequal labor. Over time, gender became a national expectation. A boy was not just a boy. He was a future soldier, owner, leader. A girl was not just a girl. She was a future wife, mother, caretaker. The deeper truth. These expectations were rarely based on people themselves, They were based on what systems needed from them. And systems always need one thing: stability through predictability. Gender became society's most predictable design. The convenient myth. A nature made it this way to preserve control. Elites needed one final tool, a narrative that justified their power. So they turned to nature. They claimed gender roles were biological. They claimed everything was unnatural. They claimed hierarchy was fate, not design. But nature never wrote laws. Nature never defined leadership by gender. Nature never assigned moral value to body. This myth was brilliant because it worked on everyone. The rulers who needed to legitimize authority, the common people who needed explanations, the scholars who needed frameworks, the religious leaders who needed order, the families who needed stability, and so the world embraced a lie wrapped in comfort. A lie that shaped destiny before a child even learned their name. Revolutions, resistance, and the unwritten story despite the strength of gender architecture. Rebellion always simmered. Across eras, individuals resisted quietly and loudly. Women who led armies, queens, who ruled independently, scholars who challenged doctrine, communities that embraced fluid roles, workers who demanded rights, thinkers who studied human variation, mystics who erased boundaries between masculine and feminine, but history rarely credited these resistors. Why? Because the architects of gender wrote the archives as well. Every recorded victory was filtered. Every fluid identity was unnatural instead of historical. The winners shaped gender norms. The losers were erased, and the erased held the truth. The big reveal. Gender was never a decision by nature. Gender, as humanity knows it today, was shaped by early landowners, lawmakers, priests, philosophers, translators, monarchs, colonial powers, educators, industrialists. It was not biology. It was not divine command. It was not a universal truth. It was a scaffold built by people with power, people who understood that society bends easily when identities are boxed neatly. The real architects were not nature or destiny. They were humans who wanted predictability, and more importantly, advantage. Gender didn't evolve. It was constructed, designed, enforced, defended, and generation after generation inherited a system built long before most people knew their own reflection. The modern turn, when the architecture cracks today, the ancient blueprint faces its greatest challenge. People question everything. Where did the rules come from? Who created them? Who benefited? Who suffered? Why were they never changed earlier? Hey, the answers lead back to the forgotten architects. People who shaped gender as a tool for control, but the structure is no longer unbreakable. History is being reread. Laws are being reevaluated. Biology is being understood anew. Identity is being reclaimed. Voices that were once erased are returning. For the first time, societies worldwide recognize that the true authors of gender were not gods, genetics, or fate, but humans driven by power. And if humans created it, humans can rewrite it.